Greetings historians, welcome to Lore of the Dragon. Today's video is going to be something of a follow-up to something I posted under the name The Reignited Legend. I asked viewers in it what they would want if they ever got the chance to revisit The Legend of Spyro, and either remaster it or remake it. Originally, I had given a week to everyone to collect their thoughts and give me enough time to gather enough options to formulate a script. However, what I didn't expect was to almost immediately have a flood of comments sharing ideas and concepts for what you all thought was the best course of action and how you might execute it. Needless to say, with the reaction I received from that video, I am more than happy to announce that I'll be continuing with the Reignited Legend series to the Eternal Night. Though, still by this point, we need to get through the second and third acts of A New Beginning. Now, before you go posting anything about your ideas for a remake or remaster of the Eternal Night, I will say that the guidelines for something like this are going to be slightly different than the last video. And for anyone hopping into the series for the first time, I would heavily advise you watch this video and the subsequent second and third acts to make sure you're caught up to speed with this version of The Legend of Spyro, since this is different than how the games actually went. Now, to address some comments I saw in the premiere. There were some people in that video that said that The Legend of Spyro didn't have to be remade or remastered. And I'll say this right now, that isn't the point of the Reignited Legend. The topic of whether or not it should be remade or remastered is something that's been covered by many people many times. And this simply is not the point of the Reignited Legend. While the Reignited Legend is to talk about what if it was remade or so it's more of a fun experiment rather than asking the question whether or not it's actually feasible or even really a thing that should happen. When I went through the comments, I found that a good amount of people would prefer a remake over a remaster. However, from what I saw, generally it was an extreme overhaul of the actual game, keeping the main story and plot intact. This is actually something I forgot to mention in the premiere, but it's the concept of a remake light, which essentially breaks down to not completely overhauling the game, but still changing up in ways that generally a remaster might not allow. So the Reignited Legend might actually be considered a remake light in a sense. So I'm not a game reviewer by any stretch of the imagination. But when it comes to stories, I tend to look for an overarching plot or a point. When I came to The Legend of Spyro, and I'm talking about the entire trilogy, I saw that the major theme was choice. From Cinder's lack of choice when she became the terror of the skies, to Spyro's choice to sacrifice himself at the end of Dawn of the Dragon. Going into the Reignited Legend, I wanted to put an emphasis on that. Not just in the story, but the gameplay as well. And from what I can see, the majority of people tend to agree with that statement. All that being said, what has been put in this video is the thoughts and ideas of those that left their comments in the premiere, and has been pieced together to the best of my ability so that the result is something for the community, made by the community. Without further delay, I would like to present The Reignited Legend, A New Beginning, Act 1. The game would start with a shot of the Dragon Temple near sunset. Instead of starting out with the temple raid, the game actually starts a few years after the raid was supposed to take place, 4 to be precise. The general area of the temple is the same, with it being located in the swamp, but the area around it seems as if it were cleared out some time ago. But over time, nature has started to take back the cleared areas. Mushrooms, as it was in the game, would dot the landscape around the temple, with smaller ones starting to grow where the clearing was. As the camera moves toward the Dragon Temple, we get to see a courtyard, one dotted with dragon hatchlings, all watching a mock-up fight in the center of the yard. As the shot moves into the courtyard, it would be here that we get introduced to Spyro, of course the main protagonist of the story. Now when we're introduced to Spyro, a few changes can be seen, mainly in his design and actually his personality. Firstly, his design is actually between his A New Beginning and Dawn of the Dragon counterparts, with a few tweaks made mainly to make his head smaller and more balanced with the rest of his body. Now from a personality perspective, he's actually more akin to his original trilogy counterpart, with him being more reckless, adventurous, and sometimes a bit cocky. Though this does not mean his Legends personality has been dropped. In fact, the contrary is true, though this will play out over the span of all 3 games. Now, getting back to the story, we find Spyro on one side of this courtyard, surrounded by hatchlings and facing off against a mock-up version of Nasty Nork. However, this one would be made of straw rather than being an actual Nork. However, there would be a small portion of a light blue tail sticking out from the back of this rendition of Gnasty Gnorc. This would be where the first gameplay comes in, and this first fight would play rather similarly to the actual Gnasty Gnorc fight from Spyro 1, even if you can call that a fight. Spyro would eventually have to chase Gnasty Gnorc until he eventually would knock him down with a charge attack. Now this fight would actually serve two purposes. One, to go ahead and characterize Spyro, and two, to actually teach the player the basics of combat, mainly the charge attack. Now this would actually only be a certain part of the combat system for this new Legend of Spyro. As in this version of the Legend of Spyro, there's way more than just a charge attack. As a result of this charge, mock-up Gnasty would fall to the ground, and Spyro would hop atop Gnasty, striking a heroic pose. The sound of cheering dragons would be all around him, but he heard one sound in particular, coming from below him, the muffled sound of grunting. He'd hop off the fake villain, and out from underneath would come a dragoness, the same age as him, colored light blue with a cobalt underbelly, and two horns protruding from the back of her head. And this would be the character we would know as Cinder. This is of course what we're going to call her now, even if she might have had a different name under these circumstances, just to make it easier to communicate who I'm actually talking about. The first main difference between Cinder and her Legends counterpart is that first, her design is also tweaked a little bit to make her head balance with the rest of her body. And her and Spyro are actually childhood friends, instead of not even knowing of each other's existence up until the beginning of the first game. After Spyro's rather careless defeat of Gnasty, we would get introduced to the character of Cinder, who was actually inside the mock-up the whole time, with Cinder making a comment about the attack used to take her down being a bit too forceful. Despite Cinder's initial comments, this scene would serve a purpose of showing the friendship between the Dragoness and the Purple Dragon. Once Spyro and Cinder finished their talk, this could give a few options to the player. It could be mentioned by Cinder that maybe they should go talk to the other young dragons, and this could be a way to learn about the dragons, or at least what life was like at the temple, from a hatchling's perspective. Or, alternatively, you could choose to explore the temple and completely ignore what Cinder said. Maybe even have alternative lines for Cinder to say based on the choice you make. If you actually choose to talk to the hatchlings, you could possibly find Ember and Flame, making their first appearance in any TLoS game, and like the others, could give you information about them or life at the temple, at least again from a hatchling's perspective. They might not necessarily have much to say at this point, but along with the others, they'll serve a purpose for later in the game. If you choose to explore the temple, however, you'd be greeted with a massive arched door leading into a hallway. On either side of the hall, there would be statues and murals of dragons past, maybe even depictions of how dragons used to live. However, at the moment, on each one would be an inscription, but one for the time being, Spyro would actually be too small to actually see all the words. So it would more or less be a tease for what comes later on. As they explored, both Spyro and Cinder would share their thoughts on the statues, and banter back and forth as they walked through the ancient halls. But eventually they would stumble upon a statue of another dragon. However, this one would be different. Unlike the rest, this one would be the least maintained, with cracks and pieces of it having fallen to the ground. However, still visible would be a collar around the dragon's neck, with the dragon himself bearing multiple curved horns. This would be the one we would know as Malefor. Now Spyro would look up to the statue with a determined smile, followed by him enthusiastically voicing how he was going to defeat this towering dragon one day, and whatever army was thrown at him. Cinder, following immediately after, would make a remark about the time Spyro wasn't even able to defeat a fake enemy, and asking the Purple Dragon how he thought he was going to defeat a fully grown dragon, especially the one they were looking at just then. But as Spyro got a retort ready, a larger dragon comes out behind them, slowly walking toward the young dragons. This dragon would be the fire guardian, Reignited. Looking down toward them, he would ask why they were wandering around the temple halls. Here, both Spyro and Cinder would try to blame each other for being outside the courtyard, but quickly Reignited would calm the situation, telling Cinder that she could go back to the courtyard, and telling Spyro to follow him. Reluctantly, the two would do as the Guardian said. The Guardian and Spyro would then proceed through the halls of the temple, with more murals and statues placed against the walls, While Ignitus leads the way to the temple, Spyro and him would more than likely banter as well. Maybe even Spyro would start to boast a little about his victory over Nasty Nork. And perhaps in response, the Guardian could let out a small chuckle and congratulate the Purple Dragon on defeating such a creature, but reminded Spyro to keep his pride in check. To explain the Fire Guardian more, Ignitus is more involved with the hatchlings than the other Guardians in this. And while the other Guardians are more occupied with their tasks, Ignitus tries to act as more of a mentor and father figure to them. However, his position as Fire Guardian leaves his time with the young dragons scarce. With Spyro though, time was not something the two were deprived of, allowing their relationship to grow beyond a mentor into something more like a father. Eventually, the two would come across another archway, this one being blocked by a door, one only opening when the Fire Guardian propelled the flame toward it. Once the door opened, Ignitus and Spyro would meet the other Guardians. Now Voltaire would be immediately scrounging through books, while Cyril and Terrador would go to meet Ignitus. This part of the game would act to introduce you to the Guardians, more showing their base traits, how they talk, act, and handle Spyro. Voltaire, of course, would keep his expressive way of speaking, with him going on and on asking Spyro how his performance was against this creature that he faced. Cyril would be a bit more cynical, but after hearing what Spyro had to say to Voltaire, his response would be one of slight congratulations, however half-forced. Terrador, like Ignitus, would compliment Spyro on his victory, however mentioning that he would make a fine soldier, instead of trying to tell Spyro to keep his pride in check, like Ignitus. Ignitus, with quick haste, asked Spyro if he wished to show the skills he used, and if he wished to learn anything else. Here would be another place you could go and choose either to explore or go immediately into the Dragon Dojo, a place of which wouldn't be changed from the original either in this case. If you decide to explore, and since the room would generally be the same, with maybe a little extra features like banners or bookshelves, you could go walk toward the Pool of Visions, and maybe if you went near it, dialogue explaining what it is could play from any of the Guardians, more than likely Ignitus. Maybe even you could go to ask Voltaire what he's reading, and he'd give a rather long explanation. If you decide to go immediately into the dojo, you'd be given an introduction to some slightly more advanced melee attacks. It would also be here during this training session that one of the Guardians would mention an element, or rather an unrefined element Spyro could use, mentioning that it could develop into anything given enough time. Perhaps even the Guardians would try to see if Spyro could use this as an elemental breath attack, which might work, but it would be rather ineffective at this time. After this, the Purple Dragon would go to the Guardians, and after Spyro met up with the Guardians, a scene would play where Ignitus was looking over the swamplands, the sun setting in the distance. Terrador would come from behind him, mentioning that as of late, Ignitus seemed rather anxious. And Ignitus, barely looking at the Earth Guardian, would respond by telling him that he could never be too cautious during this war. A quick back and forth conversation would continue on the topic, until Terrador would eventually head back inside the temple, leaving Ignitus alone to watch the horizon. But only a few seconds later, the Fire Guardian turned back to the temple. But just as he left, a distant light accompanied by smoke would appear just as night fell upon the land. The scene would then turn to Spyro once again, and another playable area, the grotto. Here, the young dragons were gathered in a room, most of them fast asleep. However, in the distance, the sound of strange banging would awake the Purple Dragon from his slumber, leading into another gameplay section. Because of the sound, you would as Spyro travel through the temple, torches lighting your way. As you climbed your way through the temple to the upper levels, the sound would start getting closer, with more joining in a symphony of beating. As he ascended, Spyro would call out to the Guardians, Ignitus especially. Eventually, Spyro would find himself in an opening to the outside world, leaving Spyro finally able to see what might be making all that noise. Near the corner of his eye, he would spot a trail of light and smoke coming from the swamp. But before he could react, a ball of light would be thrown toward him, leaving the young dragon mesmerized, yet unable to see the danger that had just been hurled toward him. It would strike the wall right next to him, throwing him and part of the temple wall flinging through the air, leaving the Purple Dragon unconscious as he hit the hard floor. For a few seconds, Spyro heard muffled yelling, and a roar of elements in the distance before fully falling unconscious. Then, just as the original game went, Ignitus would find Spyro and take him to safety deeper in the swamp. But as he fled, only a glimpse would be shown of the Dark Armies, including one character actually from the Eternal Night, the Ape King, Gaul. The objective here is not to only show the forces of the apes like before, but also to show their terrifying nature, if only for a few seconds here. And after he finished sending the purple dragon adrift, he set back to the temple, hesitating for a few moments. But with a heavy sigh, he flew back to the temple to see if he could drive off the apes and defend the location of the purple dragon. When Ignitus returned, he would witness something off-screen, but the horror that he saw would only be shown through his own expression. The banging sound would continue, but over time, it would shift to something that wasn't so much of a war drum. As a result, Spyro would awake. However, this would be 8 years in the future, by the time Spyro was 12. But instead of the war drums, which Spyro at this point might consider a faint memory, this banging sound turned to a stick hitting a wall multiple times. And when Spyro opened his eyes to see where it was coming from, he saw a yellow dragonfly. Or, as we would know him, Sparx. Sparx in this version of The Legend of Spyro is more akin to the original trilogy counterpart of his, where he can't necessarily speak the same language as Spyro. However, his personality keeps part of how he was in the actual Legend of Spyro series, with him trying to one-up Spyro, but he has a tendency to be even more nervous than he actually was. Spyro's reaction would be one more of annoyance, with him questioning why Sparx was banging on the wall in the first place. Sparx would then explain, through a method of conversation, that they were called into breakfast, or something similar. And with little time spent, Spyro would challenge Sparx to a race, and the two would bolt from a mushroom Spyro slept in to a larger one, of which smoke slowly made its way out of the top, through more or less a chimney. Now this would mainly serve to introduce Lina and Flash again as characters, and allow them to be shown more as parents, caring for Sparx and Spyro the best way they can. And to once again get along the idea that really, Spyro was just a large purple dragonfly, at least in his own mind. This could introduce another feature into the game, something to do with restoring Spyro to full health like in other games of this style, like a bonfire in Dark Souls or Horizon Zero Dawn. But more back to the story side of things. Spyro mentioned the dream he had to Nina and Flash, who would brush off this observation by Spyro, telling him that it was more than likely just a nightmare. But something from Flash, more than likely something he said, would make Spyro curious, and after Spyro finished breakfast, he would head off outside, with Sparx following close behind. Once the small cutscene was finished, Spyro and Sparx would set out to the Dragonfly Village, and just like the beginning of the Dragon Temple level, you could go and talk to other dragonflies. Perhaps even enter shops of sorts that could maybe give you custom items. Perhaps there could even be shops around the Dragonfly Village that would allow you to make a customized experience. Let's say add some sort of customization to Spyro. A cloth, for example, maybe even a bandana. Something along those lines. And just like the previous level, you could go explore the Dragonfly Village. However, some parts would be blocked off by natural barriers. Maybe bushes, vines, logs, you name it. Even around this area, there could be certain collectibles that could tell you the story of the dragonflies, even if in small parts. However, as Spyro traveled through the village, a distant cry echoes through the towering mushrooms, causing Spyro to want to investigate. Instead of Sparx leading Spyro into a situation where they place themselves further from safety from their home, the purple dragon pushes forward, while Sparx follows close behind, nervously. Just like in the original, Spyro and Sparx would run into the apes, and these apes would capture Sparx. Battle would follow shortly after, with control given to the player, and for the time being it would go as normal, with Spyro using what skills he had learned to fight the apes. However, like the source material, Sparx would almost be crushed by an ape. Unlike in the original, however, before Sparx is crushed, Spyro lights a flame, and in much the same fashion as the Reignited trilogy, Spyro would essentially become Super Flame Spyro. However, this version, at this point, would only see his wings and horns change to a bright orange, instead of markings and lighting on his scales. In a turn of events, Spyro would blast the ape trying to crush Sparx, and the apes would stand back as the player took control of Spyro in what this game would consider a Fire Fury. Here, the player would be introduced to something else new to the Reignited legend, Elemental combat. Now at first, this would act more like a tutorial for ranged elemental combat. Along with that, this section would introduce something that will be elaborated later, but would be what is called an elemental melee. This would be, for lack of a better term, your basic melee, but if you activated it and either used your breath attack at the same time or otherwise, you can melee your enemy and give a certain negative status. An instance fire would leave a lasting burning effect. Now, quick note, animals have different statuses they can give, but I'll get into that later. The area you would be in, of course, would be similar to what was in the game before, but the location would be opened up, and small bits of cover would be scattered around, allowing the player to move how they wanted to. Once the apes were dealt with, Spyro would free Sparks, and the dragonfly would suggest bringing the news back to Flash and Nina. Of course, once Spyro and Sparks went back to the village, the scene we see in A New Beginning, when Spyro realizes he's not a dragonfly, would play out, with some added details. Spyro would express his excitement over what happened, triumphantly expressing his victory over these strangers. However, a silence would fill the room, and the two adult dragonflies would tell him in short who he actually was, or at least what they knew. They would mention something that could hopefully shed light on the dragonfly's view of this war, and explain the events of Spyro being brought into the Dragonfly Society. Because of what he was told, however, Spyro would not take this just as a story and explanation as to what happened, but a call to action. And to no surprise, Sparks, Nina, and Flash wouldn't take lightly to this idea. Now, the main reason to have Spyro take this as a call to action is to try and mainly make him like his classic self, and in this alternative version of the Legend of Spyro, keep in line with his more adventurous and reckless personality. In this case, I will say that both Nina and Flash tell Spyro that he can't go, or at least they don't want him to, expressing their want to keep Spyro safe. Spyro, in response, would be rather disappointed, having just been told not to go on this quest. However, a simple warning wouldn't be enough to stop the Purple Dragon from setting out in this adventure, and that night, he would set out on his quest, ready to take down whoever started this war, much like he did years prior. But before he could set out, his movements started to wake up Sparks, and the young dragonfly would see what exactly Spyro was doing, and then go to confront him. Spyro would exclaim how he was going on this adventure to save the world, against the wishes of his adoptive parents. At first, Spyro walked through the village, and Sparks instead would tell him not to leave, and listen to the words of their parents. However, Spyro would take this opportunity of Sparks being there to ask if he wanted to come along. The dragonfly would have back and forth, telling Spyro of his concerns, with his nervous nature starting to present itself once again. Eventually, Spyro would just continue walking to the forest, leaving Sparks behind near the border of the village. It would only be a few moments more until Sparks would follow the purple dragon into the wilderness, both of them leaving the village behind. After this, the scene would turn to a deep corner of the swamp, faint daylight rising upon the land. Here, the game would play out somewhat the same as the original New Beginning, with Spyro and Sparks walking through the towering mushrooms. Much like the rest of the game, this area would be very open, and in addition to that, there would be scattered items throughout. As you went farther in, you would run into leftover pieces of battle equipment, armor, staffs, shields, anything of that sort. In some areas, like what happened in Dawn of the Dragon, fire could be used to burn down certain bushes or obstacles in your way. Perhaps it could even be used to solve rather simple puzzles. Like before, the duo would run into more patrolling apes. However, they would be a different type than what was seen before, perhaps using different weapons than the last. This being the implication that there are many types of apes, and many types of different styles of attacks they have. Once these apes attacked Spyro, Sparks, like in the old games, would deflect whatever blow might have been landed. However, Sparks would, as the system would go, after one hit would be on a cooldown, not being able to protect Spyro until it was finished up. This could be improved, but for the beginning of the game, that's how it would stay. Eventually, you would work your way through the apes, and for a little more, travel through the wilderness. But in the distance, the light of torches would show the way into a cave. This one, of course, harboring Reignited, just like in the original New Beginning. However, visibly he would be shown to be worn and tired compared to the last time we saw him. Like in the original, the Fire Guardian's reaction would be one of shock, almost lost for words as he saw Spyro walk up to him. However, instead of being surprised that Spyro was still alive, he would be more shocked to find that Spyro was so far from his home, as the Fire Guardian in this case watched over Spyro, but kept his distance, not wanting to bring the war to the young dragon's life after what happened at the temple. Spyro would take a moment to realize that both he and Ignitus were the same species, and, as up until this point, he would have, like in the original, still be trying to wrap his head around the idea of even being a dragon, let alone meeting another one. Unlike in the original, however, as Spyro and Ignitus talked, the Fire Guardian would briefly mention the war, keeping it more or less vague at best. But Spyro's fiery passion for ending this war that Ignitus feared to reminisce seemed to give him a glimmer of hope. With a little more convincing, Ignitus said he would help Spyro, and says that in order to have a chance, they should go to the Dragon Temple, and so they set off on their quest, ready to take on whatever challenges they might find in the temple. Now that's going to conclude Act 1 of the Reignited Legend, but that's definitely when things are going to get interesting, as there's going to be a lot of things about elements, a lot of things about the elemental melees I was talking about, and something about expanding on the world, but I'll save those for next time. Now again, just a reminder, if you do have any ideas for the Eternal Night, then it would be best to probably save those for Act 3, which might take a while to get to, as this thing was already pretty long. It was already pretty insane to just go ahead and write this thing, not to mention voice it. So go ahead and, if you have any ideas, probably write them down on a note, and when I actually get to Act 3, go ahead and leave them down in that comment section. However, when I do get to Act 3, I will be trying to go ahead and lay down guidelines, just to make sure everyone's up to speed. Now anyway, if you do want to keep up with updates to videos or anything Lord of the Dragon related, you can go ahead and follow me on my Twitter. That's going to be it for me. I hope to see you all in the next lore or even Reignited Legend video. Stay safe, historians.